A Voth female's muffled moans echo from the underground facility as James thrusts into her welcoming loins, not realizing his virile human seed is her species' only hope for survival. The raven-haired mercenary had accepted a mysterious contract offering an exorbitant sum for a covert mission to infiltrate Voth territory, the alien empire locked in a bitter conflict with mankind for decades. Meeting his alluring Voth contact Linux, she reveals the dire truth: their males rendered sterile by genetic stagnation. Without fresh DNA, the advanced Voth race faces imminent extinction. Now James must take on his most vital mission ever, mating with Voth females to infuse them with humanity's robust genes. The price for failure is not only the collapse of an entire civilization, but reigniting a cataclysmic war between sworn enemies. Leading James through the clandestine breeding facility, Linux introduces other desperate Voth women, all willing to pay any price for a chance at his seed. As he learns more about their paradoxical society, both highly sophisticated, yet on the precipice of collapse, James begins to see them not just as a hated foe, but a tragic victim of their own hubris. Suddenly, alarms blare and plasma bolts sizzle past as Voth security forces storm the underground complex, gunning down the defenseless females. James and Linux barely escape the bloodbath as fugitives, torn between completing their illicit mission and confronting their growing forbidden attraction. The stakes could not be higher for James, not only ensuring the survival of a dying race, but navigating a deadly world of enemies while untangling the mysteries of his own heart. In a galaxy at war, will this human mercenary's coveted seed bring salvation to his alien foes or reignite a conflict that will consume them all? Either way, these seductive Voth females will pay any price for a chance to ride a human's cock and extract the only thing that can save them now: hot ropes of pure human cum. Their lungs burning and muscles aching, James and Linux barely managed to lose their pursuers in the winding, trash-strewn alleyways of the Voth capital's slums. Ducking into a decrepit, abandoned apartment block, they hastily barricaded the door and collapsed onto the moldy floor, gasping for breath. "We can't stay here long," James said between ragged breaths, already surveying their surroundings for potential escape routes or defensible positions. "They'll be scouring the area for us." Linux nodded, her eyes haunted by the memory of the massacre they'd just narrowly escaped. "I know a place we can go, but we'll need new identities to get there undetected." James flashed her a weary grin. "Lucky for us, I know a guy who knows a guy." Using his mercenary contacts and a hefty chunk of their rapidly dwindling funds, James secured them false identities and disguises. With their new credentials in hand, they slipped out into the night, blending into the city's gritty underbelly. As they navigated the seedy streets, Linux reached out to her few remaining allies, desperate for any shred of hope. Her heart leaped when she learned that a small group of Voth females had managed to evade capture and were hiding out in a remote, lawless region of the planet. "They've set up a makeshift breeding facility," Linux explained, her voice tinged with equal parts hope and trepidation. "It's not much, but it's our best shot at completing the mission." James met her gaze, his eyebrows furrowed. "Then that's where we're going." The journey was arduous and fraught with danger. They navigated treacherous terrain, skirting around Voth security checkpoints and fending off hostile wildlife. With each challenge they faced, James and Linux found themselves relying on each other more and more, their initial animosity slowly giving way to a grudging respect and understanding. When they finally reached the hidden outpost, they found it a far cry from the sophisticated facility they'd originally planned to use. The conditions were primitive, the equipment makeshift, and barely functional. But with time running out and options limited, James knew they had no choice but to proceed. Over the next few weeks, James dedicated himself to the task of impregnating the remaining Voth females. It was a strange and surreal experience, mating with these alien women who had once been his sworn enemies. Yet as he came to know them as individuals, each with their own hopes and fears, he found his perspective shifting. And then there was Linux. As they worked side by side, facing the daily challenges of survival and evasion, James felt himself drawn to her in ways he'd never anticipated. He saw beneath her tough exterior to the fierce, loyal, and deeply compassionate woman within. One night, as they stood watch together under the ethereal glow of the planet's twin moons, Lennox turned to him, her eyes shining with a mixture of longing and vulnerability. "James, she began, but her words were cut short by the sudden, unmistakable sound of an approaching ship. They barely had time to raise the alarm before all hell broke loose. Mercenaries hired by the Voth government to track them down descended upon the outpost with devastating force. Plasma bolts lit up the night as James and Lennox rallied the defenders, fighting tooth and nail to protect the precious cargo they'd risked everything to secure. In the chaos of battle, James saw several of the pregnant Voth females cut down before his eyes, their lifeless bodies a grim reminder of the price of failure. Rage and desperation fueled his every move as he fought to hold the line, Lennox a whirlwind of deadly precision at his side. By the time the last mercenary fell, the outpost was in ruins, and James and Lennox were left battered and bleeding among the dead and dying. As they tended to each other's wounds, their hands trembling with a combination of adrenaline and grief, a chime from Lennox's communicator pierced the grim silence. With a shaking hand, she activated the device to see a coded message from an unexpected sender, Zar, a high-ranking Voth military officer who claimed to have learned of their plight and wished to help. Wary but desperate, James and Lennox agreed to meet with Zar on a neutral space station. There, the officer revealed the existence of a small faction within the Voth government that recognized the severity of their genetic crisis and believed that James and Lennox's unconventional mission might be their species' last hope. In exchange for the safe passage of the remaining pregnant females and amnesty for their crimes, Zar offered James a deal: continue breeding with Voth volunteers in a covert program sanctioned by the faction. It was a devil's bargain, but one they knew they couldn't refuse. As they left the meeting, their hands entwined in a silent promise to face whatever came next together, James and Lennox knew their mission was nowhere near the end. They had bought their cause a fighting chance, but at a steep cost. The path ahead was a minefield of danger and uncertainty, each step risking exposure and the specter of a war that could consume both their races. Yet in that moment, looking into each other's eyes, they knew one thing with crystal clarity. They would keep fighting, no matter the odds, for the future they knew their forbidden love could make possible. James and Lennox worked tirelessly to transport the pregnant Voth females to Zar's secure facility. The journey was tense, with constant fear of discovery. James continued his breeding efforts with more volunteers, spending long hours in clinical rooms. "Another successful insemination," Lennox said, reviewing data on her tablet. James nodded wearily. "How many does that make now?" 57. But we need hundreds more to ensure genetic diversity. As they coordinated the complex logistics of the program, James and Lennox found moments of connection. Late nights poring over security protocols turned to shared meals and quiet conversations. Their growing closeness was interrupted when Zar burst into their office one day, face grim. "We have a problem. A government official named Crux is sniffing around. He's investigating the missing females." James cursed. "How close is he?" "Too close," Zar replied. "We need to throw him off the scent." They hatched a plan to plant false evidence implicating the Zorgons. It worked initially, but their relief was short-lived. Alarms blared through the facility as Nixia went into distressed labor. "We need a specialist," Lennox said. "Now!" James ran his hands through his hair. "If we bring in an outsider, we risk exposure." "If we don't, Nixia and her baby could die," Lennox countered. They smuggled in a Voth doctor under cover of night. The birth was difficult, but successful. As the newborn's cries filled the air, the doctor's eyes widened with realization. "This child, and it's not pure Voth," he whispered. James tensed, ready for a fight, but Lennox stepped forward, her voice steady. "Doctor, what you've seen here could save our entire species. Will you help us?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded slowly. Their victory was short-lived. Reports came in that Crux had returned, more determined than ever. In desperation, James and Linux executed a risky plan to frame Crux as a Zorgon spy. They celebrated his arrest with grim satisfaction. As the first hybrid children were born, James cradled a newborn, marveling at its tiny features, a perfect blend of human and Voth. "They're beautiful," Linux murmured, leaning close. James met her eyes, seeing a future full of possibility and danger. They had won a reprieve, but the real work was just beginning. James felt his gut tighten as he watched the news broadcast. Crux's smug face filled the screen, the Voth official speaking of his release and renewed investigation. "Shit," James muttered. He turned to Linux, who was staring at the screen with a look of dread. "We need to move, now." They scrambled to gather what they could, knowing their time was limited. Czar burst into the room, his usually composed demeanor shaken. "I've arranged transport," he said, "but we can only take a few of the children. The rest will have to stay with Linux until we can evacuate them safely." James nodded grimly, his heart heavy as he looked at the hybrid youngsters huddled nearby. How could he choose who to take and who to leave behind? As they prepared to depart, James pulled Linux close. Their eyes met, unspoken emotions passing between them. "I'll come back for you," James promised, his voice barely above a whisper. "For all of you." Linux pressed her forehead to his. "I know. Be safe, James." The journey to the remote planet was tense, James constantly on edge as he watched over the children. Upon arrival, he threw himself into the role of protector and teacher. Days blurred together as he showed them how to build shelters, find food, and defend themselves. One child in particular, Cal, stuck close to James. The boy's quick mind and endless questions reminded James painfully of his own youth. "Why did we have to leave, James?" Cal asked one night as they sat by the fire. James sighed, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, to protect the people we love, we have to make hard choices." Back on the Voth homeworld, Linux worked tirelessly to keep the remaining children safe and continue their work. But danger was closing in. Crux's relentless investigation led him to the medical facility where Nixia had given birth. The doctor, under intense interrogation, finally broke. "They're breeding with humans," the doctor gasped, "to save our species." Crux's eyes gleamed with triumph and disgust. He finally had the evidence he needed. Linux received the warning too late. As Crux's forces surrounded the facility, she and her team rushed to evacuate. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as they fled, carrying as many of the pregnant Voth females as they could. Not everyone made it out. Linux fought back tears as she saw friends fall, but she pushed on, knowing the children's lives depended on her. Just when Linux thought they might have a moment to breathe, a frantic message from James shattered her hope. The children on the sanctuary world had been discovered and taken hostage. James paced in front of the mercenaries' camp, his mind racing. He could see Cal and the others through the electrified fence, fear etched on their young faces. "Let them go," James called out. "Take me instead." The mercenary captain laughed. "And why would we do that?" "Because I'm the one who can give you what you really want," James replied, steeling himself. "Information about the breeding program, about everything." The captain considered for a moment, then nodded. The gate opened and James walked in as the children were shoved out. Cal tried to run back, but James shook his head. "Run," he mouthed. "Hide." What followed was a nightmare of pain and questioning. James gritted his teeth through it all, revealing nothing as his captors grew increasingly frustrated. Meanwhile, the hybrid children, led by Cal, refused to abandon James. They watched, they planned, and when the moment was right, they acted. Alarms blared as the children sabotaged the compound's systems. In the confusion, James managed to break free from his restraints. Outside, Linux and her team launched their assault, the air filled with weapons fire and shouts as they fought their way inside. James stumbled through the chaos, his body on the verge of collapse. Suddenly, Linux was there, supporting him. "I've got you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. As they made their escape, James locked eyes with Linux one last time before darkness took him. In that moment, everything they'd been through, everything they felt for each other, passed between them in a single look. Linux watched as James was carried to safety, her heart breaking as she turned back to cover their retreat. She knew what had to be done. In a hidden bunker, Tsar and what remained of his faction regrouped. The loss of their main facility and many of their allies was a devastating blow. "We have no choice," Tsar said gravely. "We must go public, appeal to our people directly." The others nodded, knowing the risks, but seeing no other way forward. On the new sanctuary world, James slowly regained consciousness. As his eyes focused, he saw Cal sitting beside him, the boy's face a mixture of relief and worry. "What do we do now, James?" Cal asked. James took a deep breath, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. He knew the choice that lay before them: reveal themselves and risk everything, or stay hidden and watch as the Voth race slowly died out. "We fight," James said finally. "We tell the truth, and we hope that it's enough." James winced as he eased himself onto the rough-hewn bench, his body still aching from the ordeal at the mercenary compound. The hidden moon base bustled with activity as hybrid children scurried about, their scaled skin glinting in the artificial light. Cal approached, his eyes wide with concern. "How are you feeling, James?" "I'll live," James replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "How's everyone settling in?" "We're managing," Cal said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But what happens now?" James sighed, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "I don't know, Cal, but we're safe for now, thanks to Tsar." As if summoned by his name, Tsar strode into the room, his face grave. "James, we need to talk." The two men huddled in a corner, speaking in hushed tones. "The Voth public needs to know the truth," Tsar insisted. "It's our only chance." James shook his head. "It's too risky. If we expose ourselves—" "If we don't, Crux will hunt us down like animals," Tsar countered. "We need allies." James ran a hand through his hair, torn between the need for secrecy and the desperate hope for acceptance. Across the galaxy, Linux crouched in the shadows of a dilapidated spaceport, her heart racing. A group of Voth soldiers marched past, their weapons at the ready. "Move out," their leader barked. "Crux wants every rock on this miserable planet turned over." Linux held her breath until they passed, then slipped away into the night. She placed a protective hand over her swollen belly, whispering a silent prayer for the child growing within. Back on the moon base, James stood before a group of sympathetic Voth citizens, his palms sweating as he prepared to reveal everything. "What I'm about to tell you will shock you," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But I beg you to listen with open minds." As James spoke, laying bare the truth of the breeding program and the hybrid children, he watched their faces carefully. Some recoiled in horror, while others leaned in, fascination overtaking their initial disgust. A Voth scientist named Thea stepped forward, her eyes shining with excitement. This could be the solution we've been searching for." Others nodded in agreement, but a philosopher named Vex shook his head vehemently. "It's an abomination. We cannot allow this to continue." The room erupted into heated debate, leaving James to wonder if he'd made the right choice. Days later, James stood before a makeshift broadcast station, his heart pounding as the camera blinked to life. He took a deep breath and began to speak, revealing the existence of the hybrids to all of Voth society. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Protests erupted across Voth cities, some calling for the protection of the hybrids, others demanding their eradication. Crux watched the broadcast with cold fury in his eyes. "Find them," he snarled to his subordinates. "Find them all." On a distant, unnamed world, Linux cried out in pain as contractions racked her body. She bit down on a strip of leather, muffling her screams as she gave birth alone in a dank cave. As the newborn's cries filled the air, Linux held him close, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome to the world, Dax," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The peace of that moment was shattered as alarms blared throughout the moon base. James raced to the command center, his heart sinking as he saw the swarm of Voth warships descending upon them. "Brailer's Gate, Valden, and Zin sector, all under heavy fire," a hybrid technician shouted. James grabbed a weapon, his face set with grim purpose. "Everyone to battle stations! We hold the line here!" The air filled with the scream of energy weapons and the acrid smell of ozone as James and the hybrids fought desperately to repel the Voth assault. Buildings crumbled around them as orbital strikes rained down, but still they fought on. Cal crouched behind a fallen pillar, his young face streaked with dirt and tears. "James!" he cried out. "There's too many of them!" James pulled the boy close, shielding him with his body as another explosion rocked the base. "We'll make it through this, Cal, I promise." As the battle raged on, a message crackled through on their emergency channel. It was Czar, his voice filled with hope. "James, we've made contact with sympathizers in the Voth government. Help is coming." James allowed himself a small smile, daring to believe that they might just survive this after all. But as he looked out over the ravaged landscape of their once-hidden sanctuary, he knew the real fight was only just beginning. The dust settled on the ravaged moon base, and with it came a new dawn for the Voth and their hybrid offspring. Lennox stood before the newly formed Voth Council, her scales glistening under the harsh lights of the government chamber. She cradled her son Dax in her arms, the infant's human eyes wide with wonder. "We grant you and your child full citizenship," the council leader announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Let this mark the beginning of a new era for our people." Lennox nodded, her throat tight with emotion. As she left the chamber, cheers erupted from the crowd of supporters gathered outside. But amidst the jubilation, angry shouts rang out. "Abominations!" a Voth hardliner screamed, lunging towards Lennox. Security forces tackled him to the ground as chaos erupted. Lennox clutched Dax tighter, shielding him from the melee. She pushed through the crowd, her heart racing as she made her way to a waiting transport. Months passed, and Lennox found herself on a lush, verdant moon. She walked through the skeletal frames of buildings, construction drones buzzing overhead as they assembled the first mixed colony. "This will be our sanctuary," she told a group of hybrid families gathered before her. "A place where we can live without fear, where our children can grow and thrive." As the years went by, the colony flourished. Lennox stood atop a gleaming tower, gazing out at the bustling metropolis below. Hybrid children played in the streets, their laughter a sweet melody of hope. In the colony's central plaza, Lennox cut the ribbon on a new educational institute. "Here, we will teach the histories and cultures of both Voth and humans," she declared. "Our children will be the bridge between two worlds." Meanwhile, on the Voth homeworld, unrest simmered. Cal, now a young adult, watched from a secure bunker as riots erupted in the capital city. Voth hardliners clashed with government forces, their energy weapons scorching the ancient architecture. "We need you, Cal," a government official pleaded. "Your voice can reach them in ways ours cannot." Cal hesitated, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. But as he watched the violence unfold on the screens before him, he knew what he had to do. He embarked on a perilous journey across Voth space, visiting colony after colony. On Brailer's Gate, a sniper's shot barely missed his head as he addressed a crowd. On Valden, he navigated tense negotiations between hybrid settlers and the local Voth population. With each stop, Cal's words resonated with more and more Voth citizens. "We are not your enemy," he told them. "We are the future of our species, a future where we are stronger together." Back on the hybrid sanctuary moon, a new crisis loomed. Lennox received reports of unrest among the maturing hybrid population. She rushed to the scene of a violent altercation, finding two young hybrids locked in a fierce struggle. "Stop this at once," she commanded, forcing them apart. The hybrids panted, their eyes wild with an uncontrollable urge. Lennox realized the gravity of the situation. She called an emergency meeting with her advisors, her face grave as she outlined her plan. "We must petition the Voth government to reopen controlled breeding programs," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of her words. The debate in the Voth council chamber was heated. Lennox stood firm, presenting her case with unwavering conviction. Finally, after hours of arguments, the council agreed. As the first human volunteers arrived at the newly established breeding facilities, Lennox oversaw the implementation of strict regulations. She personally interviewed each volunteer, ensuring their full understanding and consent. Among the arrivals was Tarek, a human xenobiologist with a brash demeanor and a keen intellect. He swaggered into the research lab, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Let's see what makes these hybrids tick," he said, rubbing his hands together. As Tarek worked alongside Cal, an unlikely friendship formed. They spent long hours discussing human culture, with Tarek regaling Cal with tales of Earth's history and achievements. "You've got to try pizza," Tarek insisted one day. "It's the pinnacle of human culinary genius." With the immediate crisis averted, Lennox and Cal turned their attention to the future. They pored over star charts, searching for a suitable world to call their own. "There," Cal said, pointing to a distant star system. "That's where we'll build our new home." Lennox nodded, hope blossoming in her chest. As they began drafting plans for the ambitious terraforming project, she allowed herself to dream of a future where hybrids and Voth alike could live in harmony. Lennox stood at the viewport of the orbital station, gazing down at the swirling blue-green orb of Novus. Her scaled hands clasped behind her back, she watched as another transport ship descended through the atmosphere, carrying eager colonists to their new home. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Cal's voice startled her from her reverie. She turned, smiling at her longtime friend and ally. "It is, but the path here wasn't easy." Cal nodded, his human eyes reflecting the planet's glow. "The conservatives are still protesting. I received another threat this morning." Lennox's expression resolute. "What did it say?" "The usual. Abominations, perversion of nature, that sort of thing. They're calling for my head on a spike." Before Lennox could respond, alarms blared throughout the station. Red emergency lights bathed the corridor in an eerie glow. "What now?" Lennox growled, rushing to the nearest comm panel. Tarek's face appeared on the screen, his expression grim. "We've got a problem. The atmospheric processors on the southern continent just went offline. If we don't get them back up soon, we'll lose months of terraforming progress." Lennox slammed her fist against the wall. "Sabotage?" Tarek nodded. "Looks like it. This is the third accident this week." "I'm on my way," Lennox said, cutting the transmission. She turned to Cal. "Get a team together. We're going planet-side." Hours later, Lennox stood in the control room of the disabled processor, surrounded by smoking consoles and sparking wires. Tarek crouched nearby, his hands deep in the guts of a computer terminal. "It's worse than we thought," he muttered. "They didn't just shut it down. They wiped the entire operating system." Lennox paced the room, her tail lashing in agitation. "How long to get it back online?" Tarek shook his head. "Days, maybe weeks, and that's assuming we can get replacement parts." A commotion outside drew their attention. Cal burst through the door, his face flushed. "You need to see this," he said, activating a portable holoprojector. An image flickered to life, showing a group of well-dressed Voth standing in an opulent boardroom. Lennox recognized them immediately, the wealthiest industrialists in the empire. "I cannot allow this madness to continue," one was saying. "These hybrids and their human allies are draining our resources, perverting our very nature as a species. We must put a stop to this Novus project before it's too late." The recording ended, and Cal looked at Lennox, his expression hard. "There's more. Financial records, communications logs. They've been bankrolling the sabotage efforts, and they've got people in high places on their payroll." Lennox's blood boiled. She stormed out of the control room, Cal and Tarek hurrying to keep up. "Where are you going?" Tarek called. "To have a chat with our friends in high places?" Lennox snarled. Days later, Linux stood before the assembled industrialists in their gleaming corporate headquarters on the Voth homeworld. Security drones hovered nearby, their weapons trained on her. "You have one chance," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Call off your attacks. Stop undermining our work on Novus, or I will burn your empires to the ground." The lead industrialist, a corpulent Voth named Zex, laughed. "Empty threats, hybrid. You have no power here." Linux smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "Tarek now." On cue, every screen in the room lit up, displaying damning evidence of the industrialist's crimes. Financial records, intercepted communications, surveillance footage, all laid bare for the Empire to see. Zex's face paled. "What have you done?" "Given the people the truth," Linux said. "Your reign of corruption ends today." As if to punctuate her words, the distant sound of angry crowds reached them through the windows. The citizens of the Voth Empire, long kept in the dark, were rising up. Linux turned to leave, but Zex's enraged voice stopped her. "This isn't over, abomination. We'll bleed your precious Novus dry." She didn't bother to look back as she walked out, leaving the industrialists to face the consequences of their actions. Back on Novus, Linux wasted no time. She assembled a coalition of loyal Vothan hybrids, determined to wrest control of the planet's resources from the corrupt oligarchs. "We take back what's ours," she told her followers, "for the future of both our peoples." The battle that followed was swift and brutal. The industrialists' private security forces, caught off guard by the sudden uprising, fell quickly before Linux's determined assault. As the dust settled, Linux stood in the newly captured supply depot, surveying the vast stores of resources that would now go towards building their new world. Cal approached, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "We did it," he said, a note of awe in his voice. Linux nodded, allowing herself a small smile. "We did, but this is just the beginning. We have a world to build." As if to remind them of the challenges ahead, an alarm sounded from Cal's communicator. His face fell as he read the message. "What is it?" Linux asked, dread creeping into her voice. Cal looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "It's the oligarchs. They've taken a page from our book. They've captured me." Before Linux could process his words, Cal's image flickered and vanished, replaced by the sneering face of Zex. "If you want to see your precious hybrid alive again," the industrialist growled, "you'll surrender Novus to us. You have one standard day to comply." The transmission cut out, leaving Linux staring at a blank screen, the taste of victory turning to ashes in her mouth. Linux's mouth went dry as she stared at the blank screen, her mind racing. The taste of victory turned to ashes, but she had no time to dwell on it. Alarms blared throughout the command center as reports flooded in. "Unidentified vessel entering the system," a technician shouted. "No markings, no signals. It's massive." Linux snapped into action, pushing aside her worry for Cal. She strode to the main viewport, her scaled hands clasped behind her back as she gazed at the holographic display of Novus's orbital space. A red blip pulsed ominously at the edge of the system. "Deploy recon teams," she ordered, her voice sharp. "I want eyes on that ship yesterday." Fighters streaked from Novus's orbital platforms, their engines flaring as they approached the behemoth. Linux watched, her heart pounding, as the first images came through. The vessel dwarfed anything in Novus's fleet. Its hull was pitted and scarred, bearing the marks of a long and arduous journey. As the recon teams drew closer, they transmitted their findings. It's full of people," a pilot reported, his voice filled with awe. "Humans, thousands of them." Linux's scales bristled. "Bring me visual," she demanded. The main screen flickered to life, showing the interior of the massive ship through the recon team's cameras. Rows upon rows of cryopods lined the walls, each containing a sleeping human. But it was the face of one particular man that made Linux's blood run cold. "Tobias," she whispered, recognizing James' brother from old holograms. The man's eyes snapped open, as if hearing his name across the vastness of space. His gaze locked onto the camera, filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. Hours later, Linux stood in the makeshift conference room, facing off against Tobias and his lieutenants. The human's face was gaunt, his eyes haunted by horrors Linux could only imagine. "We offer you sanctuary," Linux said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Your people have clearly suffered greatly. Let us help you." Tobias sneered, his hand resting on the butt of an antiquated pistol. "Help us? Like you helped my brother? No, we'll make our own way. Give us the southern continent and we'll leave you in peace." Cal stepped forward, his human features softening as he addressed Tobias. "Please, we can work together. Our people—" "Your people?" Tobias spat. "You're not human. You're not Voth. You're nothing but a science experiment gone wrong." Linux's tail lashed in anger, but before she could respond, Tarek burst into the room, his face ashen. "We have a problem," he said, his voice trembling. "The Ark ship, it's infected. All of it." Tobias lunged forward, grabbing Tarek by the collar. "What are you talking about?" he snarled. Tarek pulled free, activating a holographic display. Complex strands of code swirled before them, mutating and rewriting themselves as they watched. "It's a nanoplague," Tarek explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It rewrites biological code, sterilizes everything it touches. Your people must have picked it up during your exodus." Tobias stumbled back, horror dawning on his face. No, that's impossible." Linux's mind raced, weighing options, calculating risks. She turned to Cal, saw the plea in his eyes. But the safety of Novus had to come first. "Prepare the bioweapons," she ordered, her voice cold. "We can't risk contamination." Cal grabbed her arm. "Linux, wait, there has to be another way." But Linux shook him off, her decision made. "Alert the fleet. We strike now." The battle that followed was brutal and swift. Tobias's forces, caught off guard and outgunned, fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Linux watched from the command center as her ships tore into the Ark ship's ancient hull. Explosions blossomed in silence against the backdrop of stars. Debris and bodies tumbled into the void. Linux forced herself to watch, to bear witness to the cost of her decision. As the last of the Ark ship's defenses fell, Linux gave the final order. "Initiate biopurge protocols." A wave of energy washed over the crippled vessel, scouring it of all life. When it was done, only a handful of escape pods remained, carrying the few survivors who had managed to flee in time. Among them was Tobias, his face pressed against the viewport of his pod, eyes burning with hatred as Novus grew larger before him. His lips moved, forming words Linux couldn't hear but understood all too well. "This isn't over." Linux turned away from the viewport, her shoulders heavy with the weight of what she'd done. She found Cal waiting for her, his expression a mixture of anger and concern. "We need to talk," she said, leading him to a private room. Inside, she revealed the data recovered by their scouting team. Cal's eyes widened as he read the reports. "This plague," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't natural, was it?" Linux shook her head. "No. Someone engineered it. Someone who wants both humans and Voth gone." Cal ran a hand through his hair, a very human gesture of frustration. "What do we do now?" Linux's eyes hardened. "We prepare, we fight, and we pray we're ready when they come for us." As if in answer to her words, alarms began to blare once more. Linux rushed to the command center, Cal hot on her heels. On the main screen, a sea of red dots appeared, converging on Novus from all directions. The real war had only just begun. Linux paced the command center, her scaled tail swishing anxiously behind her. The red dots on the tactical display multiplied, surrounding Novus like a swarm of angry insects. "We need a plan," she muttered, turning to face Tarek and Cal. Tarek stepped forward, his face grim. "I have one, but it's risky." "Let's hear it," Linux said, her eyes narrowing. "We infiltrate Tobias's stronghold," Tarek explained. "Get a sample of the nanoplague he's threatening us with. If we can study it, maybe we can find a weakness." Cal nodded, his human features set with fierce perseverance. "I'm in." Linux hesitated, weighing the dangers against the potential payoff. Finally, she gave a curt nod. Do it. I'll stay here and bolster our defenses. Hours later, Tarek, Cal, and a team of elite hybrid operatives crouched in the shadows outside Tobias's fortress. They wore stolen human uniforms, their hybrid features carefully concealed. Remember, Tarek whispered, we're sympathizers, renegades who've seen the error of our ways. They approached the gates, hearts pounding. A gruff voice called out from the watchtower, Identify yourselves! Cal stepped forward, adopting a rough accent. Refugees from Sector 7. We heard Tobias is offering sanctuary to pure humans. 10 seconds passed before the gates creaked open. They were in. The team moved through the compound, eyes darting, ears straining for any sign of suspicion. They reached the central data hub, and Tarek got to work. As information flooded the screens, Cal's face paled. My God, he breathed. This plague. It could wipe out everything, not just hybrids, all life. Tarek worked feverishly, downloading data and securing a viral sample. Almost done, he murmured. Suddenly, alarms blared. A voice roared over the intercom. Intruders in the data hub! All units converge! We've been made, Cal shouted, drawing his weapon. Explosions rocked the building as Tobias's forces swarmed in, the air filled with plasma bolts and screams. 2 of their team fell in the first volley. This way, Tarek yelled, clutching the precious sample case. They fought their way through corridors, leaving a trail of bodies, both friend and foe, in their wake. Cal took a glancing hit to his shoulder but kept moving. They burst into a hangar bay, stealing a shuttle amid a hail of gunfire. Cal threw himself into the pilot's seat, punching commands with bloody fingers. The shuttle screamed into the sky, but their ordeal wasn't over. Massive ships decloaked around them, opening fire. Tobias's capital ships! Tarek shouted as the shuttle bucked and shuddered. Alarms wailed as systems failed. Cal wrestled with the controls, aiming for the faint glimmer of Novus on the horizon. We're not going to make it, he gritted out as the shuttle began to break apart around them. Just then, a swarm of friendly fighters swept in, engaging the enemy ships. In the chaos, the battered shuttle limped its way home. They crash-landed in the capital, skidding to a stop in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. As they stumbled out, Linux was there to meet them, her face a mix of relief and grave concern. You have it? She asked. Tarek nodded, holding up the case. We do, but Linux, it's worse than we imagined. In a secure lab, Tarek worked tirelessly, analyzing the sample. His findings chilled them to the bone. This isn't just a weapon, he explained, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. It's extinction in a vial, designed by some cult that wants to wipe out all advanced life. Humans, Voth, hybrids, everything. Linux's scales bristled. Can you stop it? Tarek shook his head. I don't know, but we have to try. As Tarek and his team sequestered themselves in the lab, the situation outside deteriorated. Protesters filled the streets, demanding action against the human extremists. Death to Tobias, they chanted, their voices a rising tide of anger. Linux watched from her office window, her heart heavy. The clock ticked down on Tobias's ultimatum as she prepared for the worst. Then, on the eve of the deadline, Tarek burst into her office, his eyes wild with excitement. We did it, he gasped. We have an antidote. Linux wasted no time. She strode to the communications array, broadcasting on all frequencies. Attention, Tobias, and all who follow him, she began, her voice steady and strong. We have created an antidote to your nanoplague. If you release it, you condemn yourselves as surely as us. Stand down now, or face the consequences of your actions. For agonizing hours, they waited. Then reports began to trickle in of dissension in Tobias's ranks. His own people, faced with mutual assured destruction, began to turn against him. Cal seized the moment, leading a strike team to Tobias's command center. They fought their way through dwindling resistance, only to find Tobias already in custody, his own security detail having turned on him. In the days that followed, Novus began the process of mass inoculation. Linux addressed her people, her voice ringing out across the planet. "We have faced our greatest challenge and emerged stronger," she declared. "Now we must extend our hand to those humans who still suffer, scattered across the stars. We will share this cure, and in doing so, perhaps we can begin to heal the wounds between our peoples." As the crowds cheered, Linux allowed herself a moment of hope, but that hope was short-lived. Later, in a quiet room, Tarek approached her and Cal, his face haggard. "There's something you need to know," he said softly. He laid out his findings, evidence that the nanoplague had originated in their own early experiments, stolen and weaponized by the human cult. Linux felt the weight of this revelation settle on her shoulders. She looked at Cal, saw the same shocked understanding in his eyes. "What do we do with this?" Cal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Linux closed her eyes, feeling the weight of leadership more heavily than ever before. Linux stared at the data scrolling across her screen, her scaled fingers trembling as she absorbed the horrifying truth. The nanoplague, the scourge that had nearly wiped out what remained of humanity, had its origins in their own genetic experiments. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the empty office. Tarak stood nearby, his face a mask of guilt and sorrow. "Early days," he said. "We were reckless, pushing boundaries without considering the consequences. Some of our discarded research, it fell into the wrong hands." Linux closed her eyes, feeling the weight of this revelation settle on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what had to be done. "Release everything," she ordered, her voice firm despite the turmoil in her gut. "Every file, every experiment. The people deserve to know the truth." In the days that followed, Novus erupted into chaos. The information spread like wildfire, igniting long-simmering tensions between humans, Voth, and hybrids. Linux walked through the streets, flanked by her security detail. Angry faces pressed against the barricades, voices raised in a cacophony of rage and fear. "Murderer!" a human woman screamed, her face contorted with grief. "You killed us all!" A rock flew past Linux's head, missing her by inches. She didn't flinch, keeping her eyes forward as she made her way to the central plaza. As she took the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. Linux looked out at the sea of faces, human, Voth, and hybrid alike, all waiting for answers. "I come to you today, not as your leader, but as someone who has failed you," she began, her voice carrying across the square. "Our past actions, however well-intentioned, have brought us to this moment of crisis, but we cannot change the past. We can only move forward together." Her words were met with a mixture of cheers and jeers. As she stepped down from the podium, a shot rang out. Linux felt a searing pain in her side as her security team swarmed around her, rushing her to safety. In the aftermath of the assassination attempt, Novus descended further into civil strife. Linux, recovering in a secure medical facility, received reports of riots, looting, and violence spreading across the colony. Then came the bioscourge. Cal burst into Linux's room, his face pale with shock. "It's happening!" he gasped. "The hybrids! They're changing!" They watched in horror as footage streamed in from across Novus. Hybrids writhed in agony, their bodies twisting and morphing into grotesque parodies of their former selves. Some reverted to animalistic forms, while others seemed to calcify, their flesh hardening into stone-like carapaces. "What is this?" Linux demanded, struggling to sit up despite the pain in her side. Tarak, who had been analyzing the data, looked up from his console. "It's a targeted attack on our genome," he explained, his voice tight with fear. "Someone's trying to undo our hybrid nature, force us back to a pure Voth state, but it's killing us instead." As the scale of the disaster became clear, Cal took charge of the response. He assembled a strike team of unaffected hybrids, their faces grim as they prepared to enter the chaos of the infected zones. "Find the source," Linux ordered as Cal prepared to leave. "Stop this, whatever it takes." Cal nodded, his eyes meeting hers in a moment of silent understanding. Then he was gone, leading his team into the heart of the nightmare. The battle that followed was unlike anything Novus had ever seen. Cal and his team fought their way through streets filled with mutated hybrids, their once familiar faces now twisted into snarling, feral masks. "There!" Cal shouted, pointing to a towering structure that pulsed with an eerie blue light. "That's got to be the source." They fought their way inside, losing members of their team with each floor they ascended. Finally, Cal found himself face to face with the architect of their destruction, a Voth female, her body grotesquely enhanced with cybernetic implants. "You're too late," she hissed, her voice a metallic rasp. "The purification has begun. The Voth will rise again, untainted by your abomination." Cal didn't waste time arguing. He launched himself at her, their battle a blur of inhuman speed and strength. In the end, it came down to a single moment, Cal's hand on the control panel, the High Priestess's claws inches from his throat. With a roar of effort, Cal banged his hand down, disrupting the signal. The blue light flickered and died, and across Novus, the bioscourge's advance ground to a halt. But the victory was hollow. As Cal made his way back through the ravaged city, he saw the true cost of their triumph. Everywhere he looked, he saw the broken bodies of hybrids, his people, twisted and warped beyond recognition. In the aftermath, Linux and Cal faced the grim task of rebuilding. They stood together on a balcony overlooking what remained of their once thriving colony. "We can't stay here," Linux said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Not all of us. It's not safe." Cal nodded, understanding the unspoken plan. "A sanctuary," he said, "for those who survived unscathed." "And for the humans?" Linux asked, though she already knew the answer. "We have to let them go," Cal replied. "For their safety and ours." As the sun set on Novus, casting long shadows across the scarred landscape, Linux and Cal began the painful process of dividing their people. The uninfected hybrids were gathered in the heart of the colony, while humans were quietly ushered onto waiting ships. Linux watched as the last of the human vessels disappeared into the star-filled sky. She turned to Cal, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and persistence. "We've lost so much," she said softly, "but we'll endure. We have to." Cal took her hand, a gesture of solidarity in the face of an uncertain future. Together, they turned back to the task of securing their new sanctuary, knowing that the hardest days still lay ahead.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.